Steve is a hard-working brother trying to get his piece of the American pie. He's got a good woman at home, Sarah. The two long to escape the city and return back to the quiet of the South. Southern roots run deep and the couple reminisce of their origins and Sarah's alleged big butt. Now, as Steve states, Sarah's mid-70s butt was defined as big. This was later verified by the Commodores in 1977 as they gave us clear numerical guidelines. That definition held solid throughout most of the 80s despite rappers like LL Cool J pushing the envelope. Slowly, the bigger is better mindset began to create somewhat of an arms race in them streets. Then in the 90s, Sir Mix-a-Lot came along and destroyed the brick house theory. By introducing height into the equation, he opened the door for all sorts of ambiguous interpretations, thus sending the definition of big butt into chaos. Since then, many have tried to recalibrate the meaning, but have failed. Fast forward to the year 2024, and now we're dealing with this out here. Big butts of the 70s are now little butts of today. Where is it headed, folk? We keep this up, we're gonna have to call in the National Guard. Hang in there, little booties. I still see ya. A taxi cab flies around the corner. Out comes Wardell, Steve's best friend. Wardell questions Steve about his vacation plans. Steve's a simple man with simple taste. He just wants to sit back and chill. Wardell ain't gonna let his man go out like that. He suggests that Steve and him go to Madam Zenobia's, a night spot that's known for some underground activity. Now, these two working class cats have only heard secondhand stories of what happens inside of Madam Zenobia. But Wardell preaches to Steve that you only live once. Wardell continues to press Steve at the bar. He even solicits the opinion of the bartender. Steve starts to strategize how he can get out for the night without alerting Sarah. Wardell begins to clown Steve on his need of Sarah's approval to go in and out of his own house. He contrasts it to his household, where he allegedly has everything in check. Wardell continues to apply the booster cable until Steve caves in and agrees to swing by Madam Zenobia's that night. The fellas arrive at Madam Zenobia's place. They head towards the estate trying their best to look like they belong. So the fellas enter the mansion. They're greeted by a gentleman in the foyer. They're asked for their names to check against the invitation list. Wardell hands the greeter an envelope. The greeter excuses himself to discuss the matter with his boss. Wardell tells Steve that the envelope contains a note written on the letterhead of the legal firm where his old lady works. It identifies them as VIPs in the diamond industry. The deception works and the two are shown into the gathering. As they stand in the entrance, it's not long before they are approached by Madam Zenobia herself. She explains the layout of the place while leaving a little bit of mystery of what services are on the menu. The madam's elegance got old boy Steve's nose wide open and his eyes wide shut. She entices the guys to raise the stakes by going behind the red door, where the action goes to another level. She leaves the two to their own devices and they begin to roam. It doesn't take long before Wardell finds himself at the red door. They stroll through the entrance and down the stairs. Yeah, this is my kind of room right here. The dice are rolling, the cards are gliding across the tables, money stacked up, and there's a couple of sisters taking donations for their college tuition. If nothing else, I'm pro-education. Wardell and Steve are standing around with scared money in their pockets. Floor manager tells them to join in or get out. This ain't a spectator sport, Rockefeller. Leggy Peggy is throwing hot dice at the craps table. The players are riding Lady Luck. Wardell jumps on it and the winning continues. He wants to pull out early, but Leggy Peggy ain't letting no one jump off. The winnings got Wardell feeling himself. He talking trash to the stick man. The mood of the party is about to change. At the red door, a stick-up crew bum rushes the doorman. They head down to the floor and begin to rob the patron. Wardell and Steve can't believe their luck, or lack thereof. Madam Zenobia isn't safe from being a victim either. The head robber makes her run the jewels. Poor Wardell got caught with a handful of money. Easy come, easy go. Steve got his little wallet snatched too. The robbers make everyone strip down and scoop up anything that looks like it has value. Upon their exit, the distinguished leader of the crew uttered a parting statement. Never have so few owed so much to so many. And with that, they're gone. The next morning, the fellas try to wash away their sins by hanging out with the Lord. Meanwhile, Steve is trying to stay awake after a late night. And Wardell, bone dry after being robbed, is throwing invisible dollars into the collection plate. Back home, Steve is catching up on some shut-eye and is having sweet dreams. He's probably wet dreaming of old Madam Zenobia. Wifey thinks he's dream cheating. She jack slaps the brother out of his sleep. Easy, mama. Slapping a brother out of his sleep could induce a heart attack. Now wide awake, Steve goes to reading the newspaper and suddenly he goes into a shock. He calls Sarah into the room. Sarah thinks she done slapped her husband into cardiac arrest. Steve alerts Sarah that he hit the numbers. The couple begin to celebrate and Sarah already fantasizing how to spend that money. Sarah then notices that Steve is no longer rejoicing. Steve just realized that the lottery ticket was in his wallet. The same wallet that got stolen last night. Steve breaks the news to Wardell. He enlists Wardell to help him find out who robbed Zenobia's and to get his wallet back. Their first effort was to eyeball suspicious characters on the street. That yield no success. Then Wardell tries stalking nightlife folk only to get apprehended by the cops. Out of luck, they decide to go to a professional. They go to see Private Detective Washington. This cat is a paranoid wreck. Steve lays out the assignment. Washington's fee is too rich for a working man like Steve. Washington goes on about how private detective work ain't how it looks in the movies. Cat saving the day like some type of superhero ain't how it goes down. Now Washington's behavior should be talking himself out of a job, but Steve is desperate. Steve manages to negotiate Washington's fee down to a $50 deposit. Washington takes the money and damn near walks out of the place before even finding out what Steve wants him to find. After getting that information, Washington exits by window. Steve finally begins to realize that employing Washington might have been a bad idea. That's confirmed when they leave the building and see Washington getting busted by the police for scamming. Steve, that little money be gone. The guy's next stop is to the representative, Congressman Lincoln. When this cat's secretary announced his visitors, he stalls for a minute to throw on a dashiki and replace his portrait of Tricky Dick with one of Brother Malcolm. With his pro-black soul brother #1 transformation complete, the visitors are greeted. Steve tells the congressman that he comes to him because he was robbed. After Lincoln asks him whether it was by some brothers, he feigns his shock and laments the problem of black-on-black crime. Never has a broken heart been faked so well. The congressman springs into action. He goes to place a direct call to the lieutenant to get to the bottom of this. That's until he finds out that Steve got robbed at Madam Zenobia's. We can't. Lincoln goes into how these type of places are the ruin of the community. The meeting is then interrupted by a familiar face. It's Leggy Peggy from the craps table. She recognizes Wardell, and the two recall the exciting run they had that night. Yes, Leggy Peggy is the congressman's wife. Now, just a few seconds ago, the congressman was running down Zenobia's place, but Leggy Peggy discloses that it was her husband that put her on to the spot. Turns out old Congressman Lincoln is a Madam Zenobia's VIP. Steve lets Peggy know that he lost something very valuable that night and he needs her help. He asks Peggy if she can point him in the right direction to help him recover his stolen property. Peggy gives him the name of two likely suspects, hustlers, Little Seymour and Geechee Dan. The guys arrive at Little Seymour's hangout. Before they can even walk through the front door, cats are already getting tossed out onto the street. Wardell affirms that he ain't no punk and that he's going inside and laying down the law. Wardell gets inside and begins to inquire if Little Seymour's notorious bone-breaking bodyguard, Big Percy, is there. Wardell roughs up a young cat who's a little too slow handing out information. The cat eventually tells him that Big Percy isn't there. With Big Percy absent, Wardell clears the way for Steve to call out Little Seymour. Steve goes into a corny routine of the dozens trying to draw out Little Seymour. It ain't working, but Wardell is spurring him on. Little Seymour finally announces himself. His small stature brings a chuckle out of Wardell. Wardell thinks this is going to be an easy beatdown. That's until Big Percy joins Little Seymour. After Percy destroys a chair and Seymour chops a wooden table in half, Wardell has to call an audible. He gonna claim crazy now. Yeah, he had a little madness that washed over him a couple of seconds ago, but he alright now. So we good, Seymour, right? Little Seymour ain't gonna let it slide. They're gonna have to pay a price for all that woofing. By himself, Little Seymour made short work of the fellas. Back home, the ladies scorned their men. The guys marveled at the amount of physical damage that a 5'2" brother could inflict. As the philosopher Bushwick Bill declared, size ain't shit. Steve and Wardell dust themselves off and pledged to visit Geechee Dan the next day. The fellows follow Geechee Dan into a bar. Steve goes inside and asks for an audience with Dan. After getting invited over, he has to wait for Dan to complete his routine. One raw egg, a shot of whiskey, and an inhalation. Allergies is a bitch. Steve stumbles over his words, asking Dan for information about the robbery. It's sort of hard to ask a cat if he did dirt without being somewhat offensive because you're implying something about his character. After sideways hinting Dan's involvement, Geechee Dan tells Steve to leave before it comes to violence. As Steve is being dragged away, some cats burst into the bar and shoot up the junk. In the chaos, Steve manages to escape and hop into Wardell's awaiting cab. Geechee Dan and his men chase them, eventually catching and cutting them off. Geechee Dan got the fellas hemmed up and he's demanding some answers. Steve continues to tell Dan that he only wanted his help to recover his property. Geechee Dan is stuck on the idea that rival gangster Silky Slim is behind the assassination attempt. Since Silky's been pressing on Dan's territory, he believes that Silky must have sent Steve and Wardell to execute a hit. Steve decides to go along with that story and try to turn it into his favor, but it backfires. Geechee Dan reacts by ordering the killing of Steve and Wardell. Outside, Steve and Wardell are putting up a vigorous effort to attempt getting dragged to the goons' vehicle. As the struggle continues, the vehicle explodes. Everyone retreats back inside. From the outside, a voice tells Geechee Dan that the gig is up. He's surrounded. Dan addresses the man, and it is indeed his nemesis, Silky Slim. Slim makes Dan an offer. Join his crew or get wiped out. Silky Slim then utters a phrase, "Never have so few owed so much to so many." That phrase, matched with the voice, triggers the fellas to realize that it was Silky Slim who was the leader of the robbing crew at Madam Zenobia's. They interrupt Geechee Dan's conversation with Silky Slim to inform him that Slim is the guy who hit Zenobia's and he's the man that they're after. Dan is dismissive of the two. That is until they let him in on some intel that there's a huge score for him. They explain that Silky Slim stole something of value, but he's unaware of it. On the spot, Wardell makes up an elaborate story. He tells Geechee Dan that one of the things that Silky Slim stole was a letter with an address. That address is to a location that contains a safe with diamonds worth $300,000. Now, this letter with the address is really only the fake introduction letter that Wardell used to get into Madam Zenobia's. The address on it is to the law office where his old lady works. Geechee Dan is intrigued and wants to see where this goes. He puts down his guns and invites Silky Slim in. Slim enters the room. After delivering some personal jabs, Geechee Dan pokes Slim for his involvement in the robbery. Slim denies any responsibility. That's until Dan clues him in that there's an untapped game for whoever pulled the robbery. Slim comes clean and cops to the robbery. He agrees to meet back up with Geechee Dan along with the items that he stole that night. They're gonna work together to get the score. The location of their meeting ends up being at Steve and Wardell's church. Slim arrives with a briefcase and joins Geechee Dan and the guys. Slim opens up the briefcase and inside is a collection of jewelry, wallets, purses, and envelopes scored at Zenobia's. Dan begins to fumble through the items until he finds it, the letter with the address supposedly holding the diamonds. At this moment, Dan shares with Slim the meaning of the letter. Slim calls over his man. He gives him orders to send a crew over to that address, break into the safe, and steal the diamonds inside. Dan and Slim's crew leave the church with their marching orders. Dan and Slim agree to attend the church picnic to provide cover in case the diamond heist goes upside down. Steve is sitting there staring into the briefcase with his wallet containing the lottery ticket. It's so close that he can reach out and touch it. He makes a request to Geechee Dan to let him grab his wallet, but Dan is defiant and tells him not to concern himself with it. Steve and Wardell watch as Silky Slim throws the briefcase with the wallet into the trunk of his car. Wardell then tells his wife to alert the police, tell them that her law office is the target of a break-in about to go down. The church picnic is jumping off. Geechee Dan and Silky Slim join the congregation. The two gangsters are having the time of their lives. Steve and Wardell waste no time sneaking around. They find Silky Slim's car and attempt to pop the trunk. No luck. They then try to get inside the trunk by disassembling the back seat, but that's taking more time than they have. The call for dinner time is made and they have to pause the efforts. Silky Slim gets a phone call. In his car. Now this is the mid-70s, so I was shocked that a cat had a phone in his car, but maybe Silky Slim was a man ahead of his time. Slim receives information that he and Dan's crew got popped trying to break into the law office. The police were waiting for them. Even worse, one of the cats that got nabbed done turned rat and is talking to the police. Dan and Slim agree to get the hell out of there. Steve tries to run interference, but it only raises the gangsters' suspicions that maybe it was Steve and Wardell that set them up. Before heads get busted, the sound of police sirens is heard from afar. The police are headed their way, along with the rat that they captured. When the officer tells the rat to point out Dan and Slim, the rat sees goons hidden amongst the crowd. He starts to get sweaty and shaky. That little old lady on the bench, that's Geechee Dan with some iron ready to blow Wardell's nuts off. The drummer in the band, that's Silky Slim telling the rat that he's a dead man. The rat tries to run off. This gives Dan and Slim the opportunity to make a run for it themselves. They manage to jack a ride. Steve tries to stop them, but ends up clinging to the roof of the car while they speed away. Wardell follows them closely behind. Steve miraculously hangs onto the vehicle, swerving at 80+ miles per hour. He also avoids gunshots through the roof. Steve goes on the offensive and begins to swing a hammer, knocking out the goons in the car. Mind you, he's swinging the hammer with one hand while wrestling Slim with the other hand, and the car is still moving at 80+ miles per hour. That's some superhero shit. When Steve begins to smash the windows, Silky Slim pulls over and gets out the car. Steve and Slim wrestle over the briefcase. Slim breaks away and heads over to the bridge. He tosses the briefcase into into the water and jets down the street as the police pursue him and Dan on foot. I'm gonna assume they got caught, especially Geechee Dan, cause he was running in high heels. Steve jumps off the bridge into the water to retrieve the briefcase. Wardell arrives and reminds Steve that he can't swim. Wardell then jumps into the water to rescue Steve. We're in the hospital and Sarah's checking in on her man. She informs him that Wardell is down the hall recovering. Steve then asks her about the lottery ticket. Sarah confirms that the ticket is safe and sound. The couple embrace and make plans for a new future, balling out down south.